What's that sound? It's for amusement only, the EM and Bingo Pinball Podcast.
Welcome back to For Amusement Only. This is Nick Baldridge. I thought today I'd change up the format and move on to solid-state pinballs, specifically those that came out in the 1990s, the DMD era. I'm sorry, I can't keep up the pretense. It's my pitiful attempt at an April Fool's joke. Today I thought we'd continue our discussion of woodrails and some of the toys that they brought about that are still in use today. For today's episode, I'd like to focus on one invention that hasn't left us at all, and that's the pop bumper. It was invented in 1948 by Gottlieb and quickly adopted by the other manufacturers under different names. Williams used the term jet bumper and Bally used thumper bumper. They're all basically the same device though. When the ball comes into contact with a bumper skirt, which is basically just a plastic circle that is about the size of the pop bumper cap, the metal ring that surrounds the pop bumper will be pulled down by a solenoid and push the ball away. The idea being that it will give the game lively action and prevent balls from getting stuck, especially if the skirt of a pop bumper chips. Prior to pop bumpers, there were passive bumpers, and they were invented in the 1930s. However, the problem with passive bumpers, especially those that use the same design as pop bumpers, is that when the skirt cracks, the ball can actually sit in the crack and not move anywhere until you tilt the machine out trying to free the ball. So a pop bumper is an improvement as far as stuck balls over a passive bumper. The pop bumper is comprised of multiple parts. You have the cap, which is typically screwed on from the top. When you remove that, you gain access to the pop bumper lamp socket. These lamp sockets are different in construction from any other lamp socket in the game. They are pieces of metal, typically one piece, with a lower mouth that the bulb sits on, and the remainder is your common contact. On either side, there are legs which actually stick down through the playfield. Pop bumpers have almost endless varieties in the EM era and in the woodrail era. They would do different things, light at different times, provide different action, complete sequences. They would do all kinds of different things. Some have unique caps, so doing a little detective work and figuring out if the caps for your game are still available is often a good idea before you go purchase one. Frequently, 44s were used in the pop bumpers, and that causes the caps to burn over time. These machines are left on 24 hours a day. The heat from the bulb will melt the plastic because it's enclosed. So, pop bumpers are special. They've certainly stood the test of time. Even the newest games that come out have pop bumpers. There are some machines that don't have pop bumpers, and they're usually notable for their lack. So, for tech today, I thought we'd focus on the pop bumper and how to change, how to treat, how to minimize problems. Depending on the era and the manufacturer, pop bumpers worked in a few different ways. They're all still essentially triggered by the skirt. However, in some machines, 2 pop bumpers will fire at the same time, and this is because they're electrically tied together. In other machines, all the pop bumpers are unique, standalone devices, And on these games, you can have the ball move around a little bit faster in the pop area because you don't have multiple rings going down at the same time. Well-tuned pop bumpers are essential to proper gameplay. It's very frustrating to play a game where the pop bumpers need to be rebuilt and the ball just kind of goes "Ugh," and moves slowly, sadly away from the pop bumper. Pop bumpers are mechanical devices and they require some maintenance. So, what do they need and how are they constructed? Again, you've got the cap that you take off. It's typically 2 screws that you take off, take out your lamp, and then you undo 2 other screws, which are on either side of the lamp socket. Sometimes it's easier to take the lamp socket out first. So, at this point, we lift the playfield, and looking underneath, we'll see the construction. A pop bumper is usually 2 stacks of switches, which are arranged on top of each other, but some distance apart. The first switch is the switch that activates the coil, and it's what we call the spoon switch. So the stem of the pop bumper skirt rests in the spoon, and as the ball touches the skirt, it moves the stem and closes the spoon switch. When it does this, it provides power to the coil, which will then pull the ring down. When it does so, the yoke of the ring will close the other switch. The second switch is what provides your score. So, in order to clean these pop bumpers or remove them, you're going to have to take apart the stuff that's under the playfield as well. Now, it sounds more daunting than it is. The pop bumper is comprised of 2 springs, 2 yoke pieces, 1 metal and 1 fiber, the rings, 2 nuts, which hold the yoke onto the rings, the pop bumper body itself, the skirt, and the coil, and the lamp socket. So, your first order of business will be to remove the wires which hold the lamp socket in place. To do so, you desolder by heating up your soldering iron or soldering gun, holding it to the joint, and then using a wick or solder pump or other device to pull the solder away. Once you've done so, the wires should come free, and then you're left with the lamp socket legs. On some machines, those bend freely. On others, they're stapled into place. Depending on which type of machine you have, the next step is going to be different. Either you pry up the legs from under the staples, or you just push the socket out. Once you push the socket out, you can lower the playfield again, and then take those screws out if you had a hard time getting them out before. This loosens the pop bumper body from the playfield. Lifting the machine back up, you've got your coil in place. There are 3 screws or nuts holding it in place. Remove those, and the bracket that holds the coil in place should come off. Now, assuming that your coil hasn't fried and melted the coil sleeve in place, clamping it forever to the bottom of the bracket, then the bracket should just come free and the coil will want to wobble around. There is a second piece that is screwed to the bracket, and it's a secondary bracket that sits in the front of the coil and really just holds it in place. It's not a stop per se, because the stop is actually welded into the bracket, but it is something that prevents the coil from moving forward. This is unscrewed from the back of the bracket, and once that's done, you'll be able to remove the coil from the plunger. But when you do so, there's a small spring that sits in between that secondary bracket and the plunger, and that will want to go flying. So be careful as you move the coil. You want to set aside the bracket and clean it if it needs cleaning. If it's broken, if the weld has failed or the coil stop has come out or any other obvious problem, then you'll want to replace it, but typically they clean up very nicely. The coil, as long as it's pulling and hasn't melted, then you can completely reuse that. A new coil sleeve works wonders in a pop bumper. I would always replace that. Beyond that, you're going to have accumulated carbon dust and various other dirt and grime that settles on the plunger, and you're going to want to clean that off. So you're left with the yoke and the rod and ring apparatus, the pop bumper body, and the skirt. Next, you want to loosen the nuts which hold the yokes onto the rod and ring. When you do so, the yoke will come off of the rod and ring apparatus. You'll be able to pull the pop bumper body, the rod and ring, and the skirt out all basically at the same time, and you should be good to go. You can replace each piece as you choose. However, note that there is another spring, and you need to keep track of its placement. That secondary spring sits between the skirt and the body. Okay, so reassembly is a matter of doing the same thing in the same order. Now for the lamps, they're all typically driven off of AC. It doesn't much matter the direction that the sockets are placed, but I like to try to make sure that the sockets are all pointing in the same direction that they were when I took them out. And how do you know? Well, the sockets all have what I like to call an eye, and when you see one, you'll know what I'm talking about. But that's always pointing diagonally in one direction or another. Just make sure it's always pointing in the same direction when you replace it, and you should be good to go. Reassembly is a matter of just doing this disassembly in the opposite order. It seems like there's a lot of parts to keep track of, but most of them pretty much clamp together, and there's not a whole lot that you have to do in order to make sure that you've got it assembled correctly. The hardest part is making sure that the yokes align properly. If you have a game that uses all fiber yokes, most likely those are cracked, either from heat or from use. And in those cases, it's advisable to replace with the two-part yoke, the metal and fiber. The fiber goes on the top or towards the coil, and the metal goes on the bottom or towards that secondary bracket. Once you've got the whole thing back together, turn it on, fire it up, and if your pop bumper immediately fires, then you know that you've got a misadjusted spoon switch. If your score reel starts trying to turn, then you know you've got a misadjusted score switch. Adjust those as needed and try again. You can also check those out before you turn the machine on, but sometimes it's easy to get excited. Regardless, just changing the coil sleeve will vastly improve the speed and usefulness of the pop bumpers. Doing a full rebuild, changing the springs, makes a giant difference in any game. It doesn't matter the era, but from woodrail on up. So one last word. There's been some chatter I've seen recently of folks wondering if they can drive their pops via DC to try to make them more peppy. AC-driven pops can be less lively than their DC counterparts, and that's just because they're not getting a steady voltage. You have the rise and fall of the electricity. However, if you're going to drive your pop bumpers via DC, you need to ensure that your bridge rectifier is the appropriate size You also need to ensure that your coils have diodes placed across the lugs, and you want to make sure that you're appropriately fused. If one of your pops locks on, is it going to set the bridge rectifier on fire? These are questions that you need to ask yourself pretty seriously. So, I would advise against doing that. Again, I'm kind of a purist. I'm not a total purist, but there are some things which I just don't think you should mess with, and this is one of them. The game was designed for AC pops. If you change them to DC, then it's going to change the entire feel of the game beyond having rebuilt pops. One other note, if your pops still feel sluggish after rebuilding them, one other trick is to remove a winding or two of your pop bumper coil and see if that helps. Now, when you do so, that wire is going to heat up a bit more than it would normally, and so you need to pay attention. In a longer game, it could cause a problem, melting the coil sleeve or causing other similar issues related to heat. So, caution is always advisable. Start small and work your way up if you're going to tamper with the amount of wire in a coil. Alright, well that's all for this April 1st episode. Thank you for joining me. My name again is Nick Baldridge. You can reach me at foramusementonlypodcast@gmail.com, foramusementonly.libsyn.com, and you can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, RSS. We're also online on Facebook. Thanks again, and I'll talk with you next time.